Hello, I'm George Caylor, and now you're on the right side. Today's Tea Time interview is going to be with nuclear physicist, actually a neutron physicist, Rich Kochendarfer. And Rich is my guest voice on my radio spots about 2 times a week. And I think you're going to find his views on the world, on America, politics, and so on really interesting today. But first, a word from our sponsor. Today's Tea Time brought to you by Greystone Builders in Forest, residential and commercial builders specializing in new homes and small office buildings. Call Greystone at 434-610-2301. Rich, you've been with me on Tea Time now for years. How did I get you roped into this thing?
I think quite a few years ago, we got to know each other, and then you invited me to try to do a spot, and you liked what I had to say, so it just went on from there.
You know, your background's so different from mine. I'm an old rock and roll musician, and I taught Shakespeare and so on. There's an old saying, it doesn't take a nuclear physicist to do this, but you are. And anyway, what do you think you bring to the discussion on civil matters?
Well, first of all,
missing. I mean, it's just missing now.
The important part of my background, I've been a ruling elder in a conservative Presbyterian denomination, and that gives me a theological background to view the world in. And so what I'm bringing is the understanding of the general value of the civil law of God in the Old Testament to our civil society today. You know, we generally, as conservative Christians, we generally believe that the ceremonial law has been fulfilled in Christ. The civil law passed away with the state of Israel, except for the general value of it. And that's a neglected subject today. Some people even neglect the moral law, which still is in force, but they've certainly neglected the civil law value. And so that's what I'm trying to bring to our situation.
Wow. You know, you being a nuclear physicist and all that, when I read Colossians chapter 1, verse 15, you know, I think in the vernacular of a nuclear physicist, Christ came before all mass, energy, space, and time, created mass, energy, space, and time, and by him, the fabric of the universe is being held together. So he did everything. He was there before it happened. He did it all. And by him, everything's being held together. You wonder how 2,000 years ago they could come up with something like that. But you just said it. The Old Testament and the New, I guess, are just the inspired Word of God. So what do you think is the root of the present struggle in politics today? I mean, it's like a family that dysfunctional.
Dysfunctional family is a good way to put it. Because I think what you're seeing is a dichotomy between both sides, and they don't even stop to try to work together anymore. Particularly we've seen with the left has become more hard left, just like Lenin. And, discussion is over. They just need to seize power and do what they're going to do, like they have in Virginia. And so they use any means they can to do that. It's not about the welfare of the people. It's about seizing power. But to be fair, there are some Republicans who have also wanted to do nothing but build a bigger nation. But one of the things that's going on today in this world is Balkanization. And I don't know if you've discussed this on Tea Time yet, but if you look at Yugoslavia since World War II, that's been split into about a dozen nations. And the reason they couldn't hold it together is they couldn't live under one another's rules, but they can live side by side as separate nations. And the reason is because of the culture. In this society, we discount culture. We're multicultural, but you can't be multicultural because that assumes that the only culture that can get along with all the other cultures is the amoral culture. And so that becomes the lowest common denominator. And as Christians, we want to have the highest common denominator, which is a culture that's influenced by God and his principles. And so with that split, you're seeing Balkanization of this country today. If you look at the areas of the country, you'll find that different areas don't want to stay with others. For instance, the biggest one is Northern California. They don't want to be part of California. They want to be the state of Jefferson. Western, I believe Washington wants to be the state of liberty. There's 5 counties in western Maryland that have already voted to leave Maryland if they could. And as you know, recently, West Virginia made a longstanding offer to Frederick County, and then also an offer to all of the trans-Allegheny counties to join them and leave Virginia. And so that's what's going on today. You see the division between the urban areas and the rural areas, because in Virginia, for instance, most of the area is very conservative, but the cities with all the populations are going to try to rule the whole state the same way they would rule themselves. And that balkanization is going to happen. And I say it's going to happen because the Bible tells us in the story of the Tower of Babel that God put in people that thing that would split them apart to keep them from becoming too unified.
Yeah. I haven't seen anything like this in my 76 years. The way America, it used to be just America. And maybe I was in a homogenous society. By the way, my book, Surviving Georgia, I hope you'll buy a copy if you haven't already. I'm going to New York City in April to talk to several movie producers and TV producers about doing a weekly series, TV series nationwide on the stories of this book. But back in the late 40s and early 50s, when my stories happened, and they're all true, by the way, it was a homogenous society we lived in, especially my
Yes.
little group. We were all German backgrounds like you, and we just pretty much thought the same, and we were just thinking we're just Americans. But now in Richmond, we're seeing stuff coming out of Richmond. We wonder if it's even coming out of Americans. Where do you think? I'm a conservative. I think of myself as a constitutional conservative. Where are we missing the mark right now in making things right?
Well, I think that as we look at what's going on with the left taking more power, some people even believe that could end up with the one-party rule. I don't think that's necessarily true, but at the same time, I think balkanization will mean that the power and influence of the federal government will eventually decline. Now, I know for some classic conservatives, that's a no-no. They want to bring back the republic the way it was in the 1940s or 50s. You know, at the height of our empire and influence.
The American Empire.
The American Empire, but history shows that all empires only last about 250 years. And it's only a question of when is our time to decline and somebody else to ascend. And you can see that there's many ways in which we are declining in terms of our unity, in terms of a common culture, in terms of our money system, our great debt we've acquired. We've been trying to empire build all around the world with no success. And so we really have to face the fact that the future probably is not going to be like the way we want it or remember it, but it's going to be different, and we need to be working toward establishing in our part of the world a civil government that is an upright government that will bless the people and not bring a curse on them.
Well, you know, Rich, I heard a general in Afghanistan say, "What are we doing here fighting men that will fight us to death for their right to beat their women to death?" And I always thought of the American Empire as, hey, that's not right. Why don't we try something other than beating our women to death? You know, and so we're in these foreign countries fighting, and they're killing us. When we try to bring that about, we're not there to tax them and to take their stuff like the Roman Empire and all that. It's an empire of thought, isn't it?
Well, it's, the Afghans have a different culture. My oldest son was in the Air Guards, did a tour in Afghanistan, and actually spent some time on the ground. And his comment was, the Soviets came in and tried to take a certain approach. They put people in the villages, but that didn't succeed, and they tried militarily. And they were beat by these people who, a lot of them are goat herders with World War I style bolt action rifles. And we have, with all this armament, they couldn't beat them. And we go in a couple decades later with even better armament, and we can't beat them. And so he looks at that as it's going to be a failure. There's nothing we can do to conquer them people because we haven't conquered their minds. Their mindset and their culture is such that nobody's going to come in and tell them what to do.
In Virginia right now, we're having a big discussion on gun control, which to me has always been people control. For instance, last week was the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the concentration camps of World War II, when we were able to free the Jews that were still living and so on. Well, they had been registered, disarmed, and eradicated. And for me, gun control is something like that. Why do you think there's a big push for gun control?
Well, as I said in a recent tea time, which I don't know if you've actually broadcast yet, but I said perhaps it's because the leftists that have taken control of the Virginia government know that it's going to be harder to oppose tyranny with knives than with rifles. And so that's, I think, one of the big pushes. Either that or it's been driven by hoplophobia, the fear of weapons. And you can find a lot of people today that are deathly afraid of weapons. They don't know anything about them, and that drives their politics sometimes. So which one it is, I don't know. It's probably a mix of both.
Yeah, that tea time airs next Wednesday.
Okay, well, stay tuned for that.
In a week. Okay, what about abortion? Why are the lefts? Why are they fighting so hard to kill the preborn?
Well, some people have argued that abortion started as a way to do race control in this country.
Margaret Sanger wanted to get rid of inferior races, like
Yes.
she called the Negro race and so on.
Well, in this day and age, you and I are the inferior race now, according to some of our leaders. So,
I don't know about you. I'm not inferior. Come to think of it, you're not either.
But realistically, one of the fundamental base problems is that modern man, because of our amorality, our secularism, we do not understand that every baby is created and bears the image of God. Now, we don't fully understand what that means, bearing the image of God, but God understands, and he takes it very seriously. In fact, the most highly protected people in his view are the young, the orphans, and the widows. And so when we go and take life, it's an attack on the image bearer of God, which he takes very seriously. And in fact, if you go back to Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, that's the reason given for for capital punishment, is not for revenge, but because we cannot deal with a person who would attack the image of God. We have to send them directly before the throne of God to be dealt with. And we've lost that understanding. Even Christians have lost that understanding today, by and large. They do not understand the real basis for protecting life, and particularly the commandment, you shall not commit murder.
I don't think I've ever heard a preacher actually say that. I haven't heard preachers say much of anything to fight the coming evil and what's going on right now. Well,
you're not the only one that I've heard make that similar statement.
It's not like the preachers during the Revolution when they stood up for America, and otherwise we'd still be under the control of England.
And I can imagine you've probably never heard a sermon on the application of the civil principles of the civil law in the Old Testament to our problems today. And so we have, the church is as much to blame as anybody else, because people don't need Christ because they don't feel they're sinners. When in the time of the Great Awakening, if you look at, say, the sermons by George Whitefield and so forth, and particularly Jonathan Edwards, his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God.
Yeah, that's scary.
There was pending judgment that he was talking about, but we don't talk about that today.
Since we don't believe in judgment, does that mean there'll be no judgment?
Well, I think God still believes in judgment, whether we believe in it or not.
A little about Bill, like gravity. I think if you fall off of something, whether you believe in it or not, you're going to get hurt. Well, do you think that America's fundamentally an honest country?
I don't think so. I think at one time you could say that generally the people tried to be honest, but particularly our leaders lately. If you look at, let's take a common figure of merit like the Consumer Price Index, just a common statistic, but it's been so bent out of shape. And the reason for doing that is so that they don't have to raise the Social Security payouts and things like that. That is a lie if you're not honest about that. And so Social Security is not worth nearly as much. And in fact, I can tell you, because I did the math being a physicist, that in 25 years, a good Social Security check will be worth very little because although the dollar amount will go up, but the value of the dollar will go so much farther down. That's just one instance of where we're surrounded by lies. You can turn on the TV and see campaign promises left and right, which are never kept. But I think one of the biggest lies is our money system, our monetary system. It's based on fiat currency. It's not wealth. It's a debt, and we're putting ourselves more in debt by printing more money in order to bail out companies, bail out banks, provide this and that. We are, as a country, bankrupt, and we won't admit it. We're lying to ourselves. And so that fundamental dishonesty that's becoming more and more prevalent is now filtering down. And so the problem is when we do business, it requires a fundamental honesty in our contracts. And if we can't trust who we're doing business with, then we need to grow more lawyers, and then that just makes business even worse because you end up more in court. And so it's a downward spiral.
Lawyers are merchants of chaos. Unless there's chaos, they can't make a living. You know how I hate the Fed anyway. That just to have people who aren't even Americans determining our monetary policy on the Fed. I was talking to my daughter Allison, who's here for a little bit right now, and she said, "Daddy, whatever happened to that $925 I gave you to invest a few years ago?" I said, "I put it into a diversified mutual fund, and here's your statement." She said, $5,500 from $925. I said, "Yes." And I was just thinking, as you were saying about Social Security, perhaps it would have been a good idea that we would have invested that money that's been taken out of our checks every year for decades and decades, rather than the way it's worked out. We'd all be millionaires.
Yes, we would. The poverty is creeping up, but it's like the frog in the pot. When you turn the heat up slowly, the frog doesn't know it, and that's most of America today. Unless you're faced with retirement like I am, and you have to budget for the future, where your income is not going to meet your growing expenses. Yeah. You need to do something different.
We might be a little different there, Rich. In my business, you never actually retire. I brought in a young man, Abe Loper, to replace me eventually, like in the event of my death, or incrementally. At age 85, I'll simply be a consultant. But I'll still be working, as far as I know, I hope. But
well, a Christian economist I know recommends that you never retire until you reach 80, at least 80. Mm-hmm. And just because of this, I myself have a small company. I'm doing water pump development now, and hope to turn that into an income-producing business. Because I don't think you can retire now. It's going to be impossible.
One, trying to help a lot of people think different. Trying to
good
make sure they have enough money. If they want to, they can. At least they can stop working for money. Let's wrap this up on the Federal Reserve. John Kennedy, I don't know if you're old enough to remember, but when he was president, he was going to have the Fed shut down altogether, and he issued United States currency, and he was dead about 6 months later.
Treasury notes instead of Federal Reserve notes.
Yeah.
Just to clarify.
Yeah.
Viewers.
And they've been recalled. You don't
quickly
find those.
Recalled.
Yeah, you don't find those anymore. And I've heard that Mr. Trump is planning the same thing to get us out of the tyranny of the Federal Reserve. And what are your thoughts? Should they be inflationary, deflationary? What should they be doing, if they should be doing anything?
And I think this is an inappropriate question because it should be neither. It should be based on something with a real value that is not under the control of the government. The money should be a standard outside the government, not under control of the government, which means you're going to have some kind of mix of precious metals or something like that, or maybe the value of all the real estate the country holds, I don't know. But something that you cannot just turn the printing presses on and create a
like
shower
Germany
of
did.
new, yes, like Germany, like Venezuela has done.
Oh, yeah.
I think probably the best parody of that was by an Australian team, Dawes and Clark, who talked about turning on the printing presses and then opening the windows so that these bills could just shower down. And the image that they produced was so graphic, and it makes you realize what they're doing electronically at the Federal Reserve today, because they're producing $1 trillion a year, something like that.
It's a crime.
Pretty soon we're talking real money.
We are. Rich, you've been so interesting. Would you come back one day and talk to me again?
I'll be glad to.
Yeah, and I appreciate everybody watching this segment of On the Right Side with my good friend Rich Kochendarfer. And when you hear his voice on the radio, you'll know what he looks like now. Pretty much like me. Anyway, maybe he has more of a face for video than I do. But I hope you'll go to Tea with George and subscribe. You can get them by email every day, and you can listen or not listen at whatever time of day you want to. And Rich, thanks again for coming on.
Glad to have the opportunity, George. Thank you.
Thanks for watching, everybody.